Good day, everyone. Today, you and I are going to talk about CSS and how to get CSS working for you. So let's get into it. Now, CSS is one of those technologies that will take you 5 minutes to learn, and it will take you years and years and years and years and years and years to master. Some people never master it, and all I can say is that I would not call myself some type of CSS ninja or master or anything like that, but I can consistently produce CSS that does what it's supposed to be doing. It scales. I've never had to rewrite the CSS that I produce. And for those of you who are a little bit more senior, I don't have to append rules at the end of my files either. And for the juniors out there, you may have already done this. And if you haven't, this is a very common thing that happens in CSS that becomes unwieldy. In essence, there's a joke that I kind of like, where basically you say, you don't fix CSS, you just append new styling rules at the end of your file to overwrite the stuff that you'd got wrong earlier. And this is so true that it's almost painful. There are so many projects out there that I've seen that have really, really messy CSS, and it's just completely unmaintainable. And what's even worse is that okay, I'm gonna be honest, it will take a long time before you get to a point where the weight of your CSS files is going to matter all that much, but it can get to that point. So, how do we solve this? How do we fix CSS? Well, I argue that the way that you fix CSS, or the way that you should think about CSS, is in terms of the three major things that people get wrong with CSS. Now, from my perspective, the first thing that people do incorrectly in CSS is that they don't respect the way that CSS is structured. In other words, you forget that CSS is a global namespace, which means that the most common reason people have issues with CSS, in my opinion, is that they have a naming convention that is too unscalable. Their naming convention doesn't scale. That's the number one reason I think people have an issue with. You see people, I see this happen all the time, where people put up some name that is, I don't know, button or something like panel or something of that nature. And see, the issue with this is that although in a small project you may find that this works fine for your intents and purposes, but as things get more complicated, you will realize that these very loose generic names, although they sound nice at the time, they start getting problems very quickly. And they get these problems because you'll find that other components very naturally need names that are similar or have the same type of semantic meaning. So how do we solve this? Well, the way that I have solved it is basically there's two ways that I've seen that works to solve this type of issue. You can take the approach that you're going to solve it through small utility functions, basically, or small utility classes. Now, just let me walk you through it. So, what you would do is that you would have, say that you had different types of margins. Then you would have a CSS class called margin medium, margin large, margin small, these sort of things, right? And you would simply use all of these different CSS classes that virtually just have a single CSS property and a value of some sort, and you would add that to your HTML. Now, some people out there are going to tell me that, oh well, Frederick, that means that I'm going to get a really large HTML file, and that is absolutely true. That's the downside of this. The HTML, or the amount of class names you're going to need to style something, is going to be pretty large, but this scales very, very well, extremely well. And the other way you can do it, which is my personal favorite, is to use something like BEM, or Block Element Modifier. Now, I'm not going to touch too much on BEM, but this is my favorite way of making CSS scalable, and I can tell you that it is by far the thing that has worked the best for me. It's it works really, really well. I would even say that with BEM in my tools belt, I've never had a scaling issue with CSS ever. I don't have any problem with name collisions. I don't have any problems with these traditional issues that you see in CSS. And yeah, I think that should be the first thing you look at when you like try to figure the CSS thing out. Start by looking at BEM, or the other approach works as well, and that's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. The second thing you need to be aware of is that when it comes to the cascading part of CSS, I actually argue that that's the thing that we got wrong in CSS. I think that's, and this is a little bit religious for some people, I think that the cascading part of CSS is the dumbest thing in the world. It is we humans are really shitty at doing this. And I can tell you why this is. One of the main reasons why you find yourself styling, at least this is what I've found, very often will you find that you're trying to style an element on an already existing page, and you really can't, because some genius has created some very generic structure where there's layers of styling happening, where at the very top of it all they started styling like divs and spans and like doing at the base component level or the base tag level of HTML. They've created styling, and then they've created another layer of styling for certain classes, and then another layer and another layer, and it just becomes so messy, because think of it as a very, very long chain of inheritance in object-oriented programming. It's absolutely horrible, and this is something I encourage you to not do. My personal approach because yeah, sure, you need to have some type of ability to do base styling. What I usually do is that I do a reset on all of my elements, so margin 0, padding 0, and box sizing set to border box. And I do that with a star, and then I just keep the absolute bare minimum, like list elements. List style none is very common. Nothing above that, because trust me, you will get it wrong. Even if it's just the start of your project, you think it's the most reasonable thing in the world to say. A classic mistake you will make is that you will say, all right, button, and then you will style the button. And if you are not experienced, odds are, and even if you are experienced, odds are that you're going to set a bunch of base styles that over time are going to become a hindrance rather than something that you want. So later on, somebody else is going to have to come along and create override styles of your styles, basically. So I encourage you, don't do this. It's much saner to have the BEM approach, where each element takes care of its own styling. It does its own thing. It doesn't try to be clever and style. You don't use loose CSS styles, basically, because what happens all the time, and this is it ties into this, is the next thing. The next thing that happens is that people go too specific. And that's even worse. The worst thing in the world is when you have somebody who created a really loose CSS rule that touches a lot of stuff and mutates a lot of elements, and it has a really high specificity so that you can't override it, or rather you have to over specify, or you have to be even more specific than the thing that they are doing. And it's so sorry, that's a horrible one. It's really, really bad. So, but this problem actually goes away if you don't try to be clever with the cascading part of CSS, and you use something like BEM or the other utility approach that you can use as well. If you follow those two rules, you will never get to a point where you're too specific. And these are the three main things, I argue, that you need to consider and really have a good handle on if you want to get to a point where you're really, really good at CSS. Like making things nice and pretty and so forth, that you will learn. Don't worry about it. But these three things, these are the things that I see programmers who have been working 10 years who haven't gotten this right. And if you follow the tips I just gave you, trust me, CSS will never be an issue for you. I used to be really afraid of CSS because I got it, especially when I just started out, I got it wrong all the time. But I've been working for several years now, and I have never had to do the only time I have to hack CSS or do something ugly with CSS is as a result of somebody else not following these rules. That's at least my experience with this. Hopefully these tips will make you a really great CSS advocate or user, because the problem isn't CSS. The problem is that we don't really know how to structure it in an efficient manner. And to me, that's not, yes, CSS could have been a little bit nicer, but I don't think it's fair to just say that it's all CSS's problem. I'm one of those people who I would rather figure out how to make something work for me as opposed to just bitch about it. And most people I know, actually, they are so bad at CSS that they just avoid it. And to me, that's weakness. And yeah, hopefully you will not be one of those people now.